Today we will be focusing on the death and funeral practices of ancient Rome compared to the death and funeral practices of ancient Greece, focusing on two different art pieces. The Roman art piece is Portrait of a Man holding busts of his ancestors. The Greek piece is Agamemnon death mask. Starting with ancient Rome, the funeral was a very important ritual. Bodies were either buried or cremated, and then the bones were buried. Depending on how the body was disposed of would dictate the following ceremonies and the timeline of the ceremonies. During the days between the death and the funeral of the deceased, immediate family members would feast. Others would feast after the funeral, although the exact time after is unknown. Also performed between the days between the death and the funeral, cleaning rituals. Bodies of the immediate family were cleaned before and after the final ceremony, and the houses were swept out before the final ceremony, and the tomb was swept out before and after the final ceremony. Similar to Greek tombs, Roman tombs contained an area for rituals and feasts. Food was burned with the bodies that were cremated, and this food was considered the last meal of the deceased. Any food offerings after that were simple and were often just dried beans or lentils. A sacrifice of a sow over a grave was a common practice. Sacrificing a sow was the only thing that made a grave legally considered a grave. The art piece we will be discussing for the Roman death practices is man with portrait busts of his ancestors from Rome, late 1st century BCE, marble, 5 feet high and 5 inches. The sculpture depicts a man holding the busts of his father and his grandfather, which was a common practice in wealthy or powerful Roman families. The family line was very important during death practices in Rome. These busts and portraits are called death masks and were displayed in family homes. In particular, they were kept in the public areas of the home so visitors would be able to see them. This piece is almost in contrapposto, as we can see the weight shifted onto one foot, and the pedestal is included as a support for the weight of the body. The eye follows along the curved lines of his toga, which allows us to see the full piece rather than being trapped in one section of the sculpture. Death practices in ancient Greece were a little bit different. Mourners in ancient Greece were often separated from others, almost shunned, whereas in Rome it was a much larger and community activity. A ritualistic feast was not included until after the mourning period, and the mourning period would last for 3 to 7 years depending on the region. Bones were often buried more than once during this period. At the end of the mourning period, they would exhume the bones during the last memorial service. These memorials were not a private activity. Ritualistic obligations depended on one's relationship to the deceased, and those with higher status had more people at their memorial and were surrounded by more things that expressed that status, such as gold and slaves. Women would bring food and flour to the graves and light the lanterns and candles surrounding it. The piece we will be discussing for ancient Greece is the Agamemnon death mask, gold 1550 to 1500 BCE. The real mask was found in a grave circle in 1876, and it is not actually Agamemnon's mask, as the mask dates back to before he was alive. It was found in a grave circle with many bodies, and the bodies were surrounded by a collection of precious objects. They were also found wearing these gold masks, and the masks were believed to be fastened to the face with string, as there are small holes in front of the ears on each mask. These mass graves were very powerful families that were surrounded with gold jewelry, cups, boxes, breastplates, swords, and slaves. The gold was hammered very thin and flat, and is believed to be shaped around a wooden mold. This mask is abstract in its own right. The proportion of the eyes, Ears and cheeks do not line up with realistic human proportions. Lines are used to convey facial hair and eyebrows in the piece, as well as depth within the ears. The eyes being shut tells us that this will be their final resting face.